speed things up. That's the role of cities. So higher speed because of the connections. And if you have loads of connections, a high speed of change, you have loads of information, an abundance of information. And if you think that it should read overload, you're probably not really well adapted or adjusted yet to that new situation. And these three quantitative changes have an additional, extremely important qualitative effect, because these two infrastructures are different from every infrastructure that came before. They're the same in the sense that they reduce time and they reduce distance. But there's one difference. These two, mobile communications and internet, they don't have geographic endpoints. You have the endpoint right there in your pocket. So I don't need to know where you are, like it did when I wanted to write you a letter, to get the letter to you. I just send the message and the network will find you. I don't need to know where you are to call you up, like I did with a landline phone. I don't need to know where you are for you to be my colleague. And that's a big, significant change. So our environment has shifted, and we need to adapt to that. And kids sort of born into that, they don't have to unlearn anything to start adapting to the environment they're born into. And we have to unlearn a whole lot of strategies that we were taught in school. And so we probably have a bit more difficulty adapting. But we know from previous infrastructure that they have all kinds of unintended consequences that weren't designed into the technology. When we first built railroads, we didn't plan on having standardized times. We didn't plan on strengthening nation states, but it happened nonetheless. So all these infrastructures build societal effects and change cultural aspects in our lives that weren't part of the technology in the first place, but the sort of the ripples of that change. And what all these infrastructures did, and what internet and mobile communications are doing now to us, is changing how we look at different cultural aspects. They're changing our perspective. For instance, our perspective of organizational structures. When I think of organizational structures, I draw a picture like this, and not a hierarchy. Hierarchies themselves, as a management model, are an outcome of building railroads, because it was the only way they could manage transcontinental railroads. But I draw this, and that's because I learn in my network and I work in my network. Significant statistic in the Netherlands is that over 50% of all the companies registered in the Netherlands are now one-person businesses. These are people owning their own jobs. And that rise in one-people businesses started in 2000, when 2/3 of the population had a mobile phone, 75% of the companies had internet access, and 50% of the households had internet access. That was sort of a tipping point in accessibility. All of a sudden, you could be reached anywhere, everywhere. And because of it, we could loosen ourselves out of regular organizational structures. Because when we were away from the structures, we still had access to everything we needed to do our job. And 50% of all companies are now one-person businesses in the Netherlands, and they project that it will be 60% in 1.5 years. It's not just impacting organizational structures, it's also impacting our mobility. Not just physical mobility, because if you have connections to people everywhere in the world, you want to meet up with them face-to-face to be able to work with them better, so you start spending energy on getting there and traveling. It's not just virtual mobility, following the live stream of this conference online, for instance, and sort of teleporting into it, or Second Life like in the panel before it. It's also mental mobility, because if you're constantly in touch with all your different communities, you're continuously in touch with all the different contexts that you're operating in. And these contexts have come loose from the geographic location where they were as well. And you have to switch between those contexts. And you have to do that pretty fast, because people that call you up, they don't know where you are. So they assume that you know exactly what they're on about and what the context is in which you're calling them. So you have to switch between contexts. And this is the famed multitasking we're always talking about. But it's just switching to context, because you have to be ready when somebody contacts you. Planning is changing as well, because when there's loads of connections, you create a very complex environment. And in complex environments, you can't really predictably plan, because there's no linear path in 12 steps from A to B with 5 nice milestones along the way. You don't have that luxury. What you can plan is create the conditions, top-down, under which bottom-up processes will blossom that yield the results that you're looking for. So it's changing planning. And it's changing workplace. Because workplaces are all about access to the people, the information, the documents, the production means, the capital that you need to do the tasks that are allocated to you. And if your tasks have to do with contacting people and working with digital artifacts, then everything that has Wi-Fi and coffee is suitable as a workplace. So why not search one out that is more agreeable than a cubicle down the hall? And it also means, at least when you're in that fully networked environment, that work-life balance as a term is no longer a contradiction or a paradox. It just fades away. And this, again, is a picture from a conference. Second sideline, bring your kids to conferences. All that information, all that sharing, also creates a new perspective on what is relevant. Because when sharing is expensive, and it takes a long way for your letter to arrive, you better make it relevant to the one that receives it. But the point in communication is that the receiver decides what is relevant and not the sender. But now we're in a situation where sharing is extremely cheap. If you're connected to the infrastructure, it's free. And that means it's now possible to share information like, I'm drinking a cup of coffee, I'm waiting for the bus and it's 5 minutes late again. Twitter is full of these messages. And if you read that and you don't know these people, it's trivial. It doesn't mean anything. But if you know these people, then it all of a sudden has a different dynamic. Because normally you only know from the people that are close to you whether they're drinking coffee or whether they are waiting for the bus that doesn't arrive. Now you see that happening to people that you know half a world away. And it makes them feel closer because we associate that kind of information with geographic proximity. And then, all of a sudden, a cup of coffee waiting for the bus is relevant again. It also means sharing more stuff. I mean, the answer to information overload is sharing even more information. It also changes the way we tell stories. We saw lots of examples about that in the different sessions, videos. So the different way of sharing experiences. This is a client and a friend of mine comparing their iPhone apps. So how we speak to each other, how we tell and share stories is changing as well. And that's an extremely human activity, sharing stories. This is what we do. I mean, what is successful on the internet? Talking to each other, telling stories. Visibility is also changing. It used to be that if you share something and that gets aggregated into a big heap, your face would be lost. You wouldn't be visible as the one contributing that little tidbit of information to the mountain that is there. Anyone who has ever put documents into an intranet knows how that works. You publish it and then it's gone, it's out of your hands. But if you want to be able to filter all your information through your network, you have to know where it comes from, because that's the filtering context that you use. And that means that you have to stay visible with every little tidbit that you're sharing. And that's why in all these networks, you all have these avatars right next to it, and you can always drill back, even if it's aggregated to the person that originally shared it, because that helps you filter it, that helps you validate the information. Well, I'll shorten the list a bit, I guess, but agility is also changing. If you're in a big organization, you don't mind that it's slow in turning because everybody else is in big organizations as well. But if you are smaller, and one-person businesses, for instance, are, then agility takes on a new quality, and a kayak might be better than your oil tanker. Coming back to complexity, when there's loads of connections between people, you get into a complex environment. There is no predictability, so planning changes, but it also means you have to embrace and build in your knowledge about uncertainty. You have to take into account that you won't know the outcome. And that means not setting everything on one big plan. It means experimenting a lot to see what works. And we saw loads of experiments today, but that's what you need to do. Keep on experimenting. And in the end, all these changes will add up to having a different perspective of what it means to be free and actually what it means to be human. And if you thought that's a pretty big effect of just the state of the infrastructure that we have now, and you're already overwhelmed with all the connections and all the information that comes from being connected to everybody else in the world, imagine when all the objects around you start doing the same. Because this is where the Internet of Things, the development of applications there, is just about at the same stage as social software was 6-7 years ago. The first applications are there. The